Kasparov was the youngest world chess champion at the age of 22, defending his title 5 times. He broke Bobby Fischer's rating record in 1990 and even beat the IBM supercomputer Deep Blue. He retired from chess in 2005 as the world's top-ranked player to lead Russia's pro-democracy movement. And he's lived in New York City since 2013 after Vladimir Putin's crackdown on dissidents. He's been the contributing editor at the Wall Street Journal since 1991, and he's now chairman of the New York-based Human Rights Foundation, succeeding Václav Havel. He's the author of several books about chess. His newest book is about the history of modern Russia and the conflict between its president, Vladimir Putin, and the causes of freedom and democracy. It's called Winter is Coming: Why Vladimir Putin and the Enemies of Democracy Must Be Stopped. The topic is very appropriate to the Nixon library because Nixon's political career spanned the Cold War, and he's always had keen observations on the actions of Moscow. He had visited Russia as a vice president and became the first president to visit Russia in 1972 when he signed the historic anti-ballistic missile and strategic arms limitation treaties. In 1994, Nixon counseled then-President Clinton on how the U.S. should deal with post-Soviet Russia. President Nixon advised his successor to take a tough stance on Russia's aggression toward its neighbors and to prevail on its leadership, the consequences of slow economic reforms and military adventurism beyond its borders. I'll leave it to our speaker to tell the rest of the story. Ladies and gentlemen, Garry Kasparov.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Wow. If only my die-hard communist grandfather could see me today. Thank you for the introduction. So it was short and sweet. So I'm always afraid of long introduction taken from Wikipedia, because you can always learn something about your own life that you never heard of before. So the title of the book, Winter is Coming, few can recognize that the title is borrowed from famous books and TV show, Game of Thrones. And I thought it was an appropriate title because as in the book and the TV show, this motto is a warning about dark and dangerous times ahead of us. And it's not just about the climate change, or just about a cycle, though of course history goes in cycles. And we made a big mistake 25 years ago believing that history has ended. It was the title of a very famous and best-selling book of Francis Fukuyama, The End of History. And I have to confess, I believe many in this room probably made the same mistake, that the end of the evil empire, the end of the Cold War, the collapse of the Soviet Union could lead us to a bright future. So the job was done. So forgetting that, as Ronald Reagan said, that freedom is always one generation away from extinction. This winter, geopolitical winter, could last or could be a short one, and it depends entirely on us, whether we're ready to meet it, to meet all the challenges, or we'll be still complacent, believing that it's just a season that comes and goes. And in order to understand these challenges and to look into the future and to work out a strategy, so we have to learn from the past. In my previous life as a professional chess player, I used to look at my games and to understand why certain moves were good and certain moves were not good, and what would be the lesson to get from my previous experience to invest in a new strategy that will keep me at the cutting edge ahead of any opposition. I remember that when I and my longtime friend and associate co-author Mick Gringert, we entered the doors of the publishing house last January, actually January this year, and we suggested our book to be printed in October. The first question was October 2016. We said no, it's about October 2015, because I believe that this book would contain very important material for the presidential debate. I knew, as a good scholar of American history and history in general, that domestic issues were always dominant. But I also sensed, as a professional player, that these elections could be different, because the world is getting smaller every day. And we cannot ignore things that are happening 1,000 miles away, because they somehow will affect us. And I thought that my story could help to initiate debate that will lead to the rebirth of a comprehensive, adequate foreign policy that will eventually restore American leadership and protect the free world against new threats. The publisher actually accepted it. They even accepted immediately the title, which, as anybody who published the book knows, that it's very unlikely. So there are always 10 different tries before they come up with the 11th suggestion. This time it was, yes, okay. But they were confused, as a liberal publisher in New York City, about the enemies of the free world. Because I said, enemies of the free world, it reminds us about the Cold War. I said, of course, the winter is coming. While I was on the book tour, starting from the East Coast, a cellar tour, visiting Philadelphia, Boston, D.C., then moved to the Midwest, St. Louis, Kansas City, Missouri, Chicago, and now this is the West Coast. So I was asked many times about the title of the book. So Vladimir Putin. Who is Vladimir Putin? Is he dangerous? Why we should isolate him? Because look at the Middle East. So I'll cover this ground later. Of course, about the enemies of the free world. So, but here in California, the most popular question: what is winter? So, and I have to say the weather is not very complimentary to my message. So, the book contains 3 stories, and it, of course, one of them is about the rise and fall of Russian democracy, from Gorbachev's retreat from Eastern Europe to Putin's invasion of Ukraine. The second element of the book is my personal perspective as a witness, and in many cases a participant of the events that took place in Russia, in the former Soviet Union, and elsewhere. And it's always important to tell the story. I was not, and I'm not, a political pundit sitting somewhere in the comfort of your study, analyzing events and just telling you what other people did wrong. So in many cases I was directly engaged. And the third and probably most important part of the book is what the West did, or to be more precise, what the West didn't do to stop it from happening, to come up with a comprehensive strategy that could, move us from the Cold War era into new bright future. So before I move into the events described in the book, I should say a few words about my own engagement in politics or in public life. Chess in the Soviet Union, as you can guess, was more than just a game. It was a very important ideological tool to demonstrate the intellectual superiority of communist regime over decadent West. So that's why the Fischer-Spassky match in 1972, I guess some of you saw the movie Pawn Sacrifice. Yeah, I have to say, despite the distortion of historic facts, it's a good movie because it has recreated the atmosphere on both sides of the Iron Curtain. And I have to give credit to Tobey Maguire and Lee Schreiber about presenting these two individuals, Fischer-Spassky, and helping us to understand how important was the match, both for America and, in my case, for the Soviet Union. Because losing the title to an American, sort of in the midst of the Cold War, it was taken by the communist government as an insult of the highest degree. And they looked for someone, a young champion, to take on Bobby Fischer, and they found Anatoly Karpov, a great player, absolutely great player, great champion. Karpov became the challenger. Then Fischer walked away. I'm not here to spend time describing, the problems of Fischer's character. Actually, the movie also displayed the problems that later turned him into a crazy man. Which was tragic for chess, because he could do a lot to make this game a mainstream story in this country and in the world. And Karpov became a world champion and a favorite of the system, a darling of the system. He even played 2 matches with former Soviet Grandmaster defector Viktor Korchnoi, and beating Korchnoi, he gained even more respect and admiration from Soviet authorities. Leonid Brezhnev, the Secretary General of the Communist Party himself, hugged Karpov, embraced him, kissed him, and said, "You got the crown, you must keep it." So that was almost a direct order. Not for Karpov, for authorities. And that was the time when I've been climbing to the top. When I was 17, 18, everybody knew that most likely I would be challenging Anatoly Karpov for the crown. And Soviet authorities didn't like it because I was pretty good and I could really challenge Karpov. And they had some doubts about my loyalty to the system. So, dictatorial regimes always had a good animal instinct. That's why they survived for so long. I could hardly blame them, because on one side, they had Anatoly Karpov, a Russian champion from Urals, who proved his loyalty to the system. And on the other side, they had a half Armenian, half Jewish boy from the southern outpost of Russian Empire, Soviet Union. For American audience, I always want to tell that I was born and raised in the deep south, right next to Georgia. Which is perfectly correct if you remember that it was the deep south of the USSR, in the capital of the Republic Azerbaijan, Baku, right next to the Republic of Georgia. I realized at a very early age that I had no choice but to fight 2 battles at the chessboard, but also sort of to be proactive, defending my rights to challenge Karpov. And it's like, it's step by step. I could see that challenging Chess Federation, led me to challenge the sport authorities, challenging sport authorities in the Soviet Union to challenge the International Federation, which was under strict control of KGB. And then eventually, you end up challenging the system. I won my title in 1985, 30 years ago, so I always love to see this picture because, I have very different hair. Yes, we played with Karpov 5 matches. The last one was the most important politically. It was split between New York City and the city of Lyon in France. First half in the US and the second half across the Atlantic in France. And before the match, I made a most important decision to challenge Soviet authorities and to establish my credentials. Though before, I was known for making statements, giving interviews, being not a very obedient citizen of the Soviet Union, recognizing that as a world champion, I could do a lot of difference by, demonstrating to millions of my compatriots that they could challenge the regime. I could be silent, but that would be a wrong message. So just someone had to show the way. And in 1990, in September, I publicly refused to plant the Soviet flag, demanding Russian flag to be next to me at the table. That was quite a scandal. And also it was quite a shock because very few people knew how the Russian flag looked like. You couldn't find a Russian flag in New York City, and my mother spent her night, having a sticker and a few ribbons, actually making it so that this Russian flag. And when I showed up in this morning show, I think it was CBS This Morning, I mean, they looked at me and carrying this flag and asked what it is. Said it was a Russian flag. It took 4 games before International Chess Federation, under the pressure from Soviet authorities, decided to remove the flag. But both flags were removed. Russian flag on my side and Soviet flag on the Karpov side. And I treated it as a psychological victory. And also in 1990 was the first year when I made my entry into, I wouldn't call it US politics, but an introduction to US politicians. It was the first time I spoke at the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal. As a result of this meeting, they published an article, but also recommended me to meet people who were very much in charge of US foreign policy. And at age 27, I found myself in the White House, sitting across the table with General Scowcroft, the head of National Security Council, assisted by the head of the Soviet desk, the rising star of US foreign policy, Condoleezza Rice. The meeting took about 45 minutes, maybe a bit more, and it was mutually disappointing. Now, they asked me about Gorbachev. And I was not very complimentary, because I could see that Gorbachev, despite all the admiration that surrounded him in the free world, he had no other agenda but to rebuild Soviet system and make it more competitive. Gorbachev's famous motto was to build a socialism with a human face. My response was that Frankenstein also had a human face. And I shared my reservations with General Scowcroft and Condoleezza Rice. They didn't believe me. They didn't believe that Gorbachev's star was falling. And then they asked me about Boris Yeltsin. And that was the end of March 1990, and in 2 months or so, the elections were scheduled in the Congress of People of Russian Federation, and I confidently predicted that Yeltsin would be elected a chairman of this body. And eventually I said he would probably become the president of Russia because, in my view, at that time, the split of the Soviet Union was very much in the agenda. I wouldn't predict it, wouldn't bet my bottom dollar, but I thought it was moving, in this direction. They looked at me just in disbelief. And the general said, but Yeltsin is a drunk and loose cannon. I looked at him with a surprise, and I asked, whether they were interested in Yeltsin's personal qualities or his political future. As I said, it was mutually disappointing. So because the administration of Bush 41 believed that preserving status quo and saving Soviet Union, and many remember former Yugoslavia, was paramount for stability in the world. We know what's happened in Yugoslavia. But also in the Soviet Union, there were some very famous mistakes, like Chicken Kyiv speech, where Bush 41 blamed Ukrainian nationalists for endangering the stability in the Soviet Union. Again, it was not well received by people both in Ukraine and other parts of the former Soviet Union. So why it was mutually disappointing for me is because I was 27, and though I was not a hostage to Soviet propaganda, but I believed, that the United States had powerful intelligence, military, and the CIA and Pentagon could supply the right information to the White House. And again, I lost my admiration to this mythology in mid-November 1991 when I was in DC receiving a Keeper of the Flame award. And at the same day, there was a very pompous reception in the White House organized by President Bush and his Secretary of State, Jim Baker III, receiving a newly appointed, reappointed actually, Minister of Foreign Affairs of the USSR, Edward Shevardnadze. They were celebrating at this reception a new dawn in the Soviet-American relations, 5 weeks before the collapse of the Soviet Union. I mean, I was shocked. But again, I just realized that some people are simply not ready to accept new realities. You know, it was a shocking change, not only for us on other side of the Iron Curtain, but also for many people in the free world, because they expected that Cold War could last for generations, and suddenly it was over. And here we come to a very important moment that I think was a turning point, and that led to many problems we are facing today. In 1991, 1992, this country was absolutely all-powerful, and it was the right moment to start building new institutions to lead the way into a brighter future, more prosperous, peaceful, and coordinated between all democracies and countries that were newly adopted the democratic style of governance. Somehow you can compare the situation 91, 92, 93 to the late 40s. Though, of course, it was much more dangerous at that time, because America, after World War II, suddenly discovered that there was another enemy, the former ally. And Harry Truman's administration had to build institutions that proved to be instrumental of preserving freedom in many parts of the world and eventually helping to win Cold War. CIA, National Security Council, NATO, Marshall Plan for Europe, a reorganization of Voice of America to make it a competitive entity to fight Soviet propaganda machine. And everything was done, you know, at a time when Soviet Union was really all-powerful and, you know, posed a real threat. I don't have to tell you about this. And that's why when I hear today stories about Putin being so dangerous that nobody could challenge him, my question is, are you kidding me? Is he more dangerous than Joseph Stalin in 1948? Come on. So when Harry Truman ordered airlift to supply West Berlin for 11 months, and by the way, Stalin didn't shoot a single American plane, because as I said, dictators, they have very good nose, animal instinct. If they smell blood, they go for a kill. If they smell strength, they back off. And in 1991, 1992, again, there was a shift in American domestic policy, and naturally the public was very happy with the outcome of the Cold War. It was time to celebrate. And Bill Clinton took over. I think it was a reflection of this sort of relief. And his agenda was not to reform anything in foreign policy, because nobody thought foreign policy was important. The big mistake made at those days was to believe that evil could be wiped out completely from the face of Earth. But evil doesn't disappear. It could be buried temporarily under the rubbles of Berlin Wall, but one day it sprouts back. And moments were missed, one after another. And few remember that some of the current problems, crises that we're facing today, they had their roots in the 90s. Say, Iranian nuclear problem, the disastrous nuclear deal that has been signed by Obama's administration. It all started in the 90s. The first president who raised the issue of Iranian nuclear programs with Russians was Bill Clinton in 1995. It was the beginning of Russian-Iranian cooperation and the first transfer of Russian nuclear technologies to Iran. And the United States Congress passed a resolution tying the financial aid to Russia to this nuclear cooperation, so to urging Clinton to end it as a condition for further financial assistance. Bill Clinton didn't believe it was important for national security. In 1994, a year before, Clinton administration signed a nuclear deal with North Korea. If you have time, you can go back and read the transcripts of discussions, debates, disagreements between Seoul, the South Korean government, and Bill Clinton's White House, where South Koreans warned about North being deceitful and will eventually, they predicted the North will eventually renege on its obligations, and after collecting American aid and having more breathing space to survive, will come up will continue its nuclear program. If you erase the names of individuals and the countries from this conversation, you could be mistaken for the debates between Netanyahu and Obama. It's about repetition of history and missing great moments that could save us a lot of trouble. The 90s, they were quiet and happy years here in this country and in Europe. And many people remember these years, as like, golden era, paradise. And naturally, it's just as America was in the position to call all the shots. But if I can make a chess parallel, using chess metaphor, in 1992, United States has a completely winning position and could mate opponents in 2 or 3 moves. In the year 2000, position was still very good, but it's no longer winning by force. It has changed. And while everybody celebrated, the end of the Cold War and new bubbles that, popped in, on the surface and blew up, Al-Qaeda was ready to strike. And that's why, we should recognize that these first 8 years post-Cold War, they were not very successful in coming up with the comprehensive foreign policy. What in fact happened after 1991, now looking at 3 consecutive administrations, Democrats, Republicans, and Democrats again, is that United States foreign policy, began functioning as a pendulum, swinging from one side to another. Clinton did very little, W did too much, Obama has been doing nothing. And it had, and it still has, a huge impact, negative impact on Americans' image abroad, because nobody knows what to expect. The credibility of the Oval Office that was unshaken during Cold War, whether it was a Republican or Democrat making executive decisions, now it's hitting new lows every day. I recently watched first televised presidential debates. It's Richard Nixon and John F. Kennedy. And I was truly amazed, by the quality of this conversation, because everybody's watching debates these days. And it's not just about civility of the debate, not about a mutual respect for each other, but it was about recognizing that despite all the differences, the debate was between 2 Americans thinking about the future of their country. And very often you could hear, I agree with Senator Kennedy, I agree with Vice President Nixon. Can you imagine hearing these words today? The disagreements, of course they were there, but there were disagreements on means, not on goals. Foreign policy was something that could change only within a range, because it was all about fighting an existential threat, an enemy that was there and has been threatening the very existence of the free world. So I think it's very important now to go back to the same algorithm, to restore it, though I see very little chance that the Democratic Party in its current form could follow the traditions of Harry Truman and John F. Kennedy. It's a party of Clinton and Obama, and I'm not thrilled to state this fact. But before we reach Obama's years, so we had George W. And of course, he faced an immense challenge because 8 months, since his inauguration, he had to deal with 9/11 attack. That was a shocking experience, tragedy, and naturally it had a mark on his foreign policy. But before it happened, I think he made a fundamental mistake that prevented him from finding the right moves in his giant geopolitical chessboard. In June 1991, he met Vladimir Putin. And by the way, Vladimir Putin's rise to power in Russia was not very traditional for dictators of the past because he was not fighting for power, just kicking and shouldering, his rivals. He came out of the blue. 4 years before being elected president of Russia, he was unemployed after his boss, Anatoly Sobchak, a prominent Russian politician, mayor of St. Petersburg, lost elections. Putin was his deputy, and I think that was a good lesson for him. Elections can be lost. Dangerous. And by the way, I remember that in 1996, I was a guest of Anatoly Sobchak in St. Petersburg, and probably, I would say most likely, I had to meet Putin, but I couldn't remember. And I have pretty good memory. But that it tells you about the quality of this KGB operative. He was there, but he was not there. And Putin, while climbing to the very top of Russian power, he made few important statements that, in my view, just demonstrated, his true colors. As the prime minister of Russia, appointed by Yeltsin in 1999, he met his former colleagues in the KGB headquarters. And just to make sure that they're not former colleagues, he said, quote unquote, once KGB, always KGB. Direct quote. As a president of Russia, his first executive act was to restore Soviet anthem. You say not a big deal, it's symbolic. Absolutely, it is symbolic. It was like a Freudian message to all of us, what Putin would do if given a chance. And later on, in the first year of his presidency, he immediately went after free television that could criticize Yeltsin over Yeltsin's years, but was immediately shut down when Putin took power. Since first year of Putin's rule, Russia did not have a single live TV show. Just to remember, so not a single live TV show. It's all recorded, all under control. And Putin repeatedly said during his years, the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical disaster of the 20th century. Now, combining all these facts, what would you think about Vladimir Putin? And to my, surprise, though I was not, as I explained to you already, I was not very enthusiastic about US foreign policy, but still to see George W. Bush, even before 9/11, sitting across the table with Vladimir Putin and saying at the press conference that I looked in his eyes and I saw his soul, I nearly shouted, don't play a shrink. You're not, doing psychoanalysis, look at his record. Don't look at his eyes. It's KGB, capital letters on his forehead. But, remember, that was the beginning of Putin's very savvy game with the foreign leaders. He could correctly gauge their caliber and play the game they wanted. What was the story that helped him to win over George W. Bush? His story about little Vladimir Putin being baptized in secrecy, hiding the cross, and in KGB, hiding the cross. But I guess Bush nearly cried. And then 9/11, two phone calls, each probably 1 minute. Condoleezza Rice first, then George W. It cost Putin nothing, but it created an image for Bush that Putin was an ally. Why Putin did it? Because he knew at that time he needed friends. He had to consolidate his power in Russia, so he wanted to be friends with Americans, Brits, French, because he had to sell him to Russian public as the democratic leader. It was a very important part of the game, and he did it, give him credit, perfectly. Why it worked in Russia and why Russian people wanted to see a democratic leader, quote unquote. Because as I said, in 1991, 1992, at the beginning of this transition from 74 years of communism into free society, Russians, Soviets at that time, but Russians in Russian Federation and citizens of other former Soviet republics, they had no idea about the way democracy functioned in the West. Checks, balances, different branches of the government, that was too complicated. There was a very simple equation in the minds of millions and millions of my compatriots. Soviet system didn't work out. It couldn't provide us proper living standards. On the other side of the Iron Curtain, people had much better lives. Why? Because there was a democracy, and democracy was a very simple mechanism. They voted. The whole idea was that you can vote, you can change the government, and it automatically leads to sort of to a better life. As I said, they simply confused ballot box with ATM. But it didn't work out. The Russian people kept voting for Yeltsin, for reforms, once and again. But for many of them, it didn't improve their lives. And even these lives were getting worse and worse. So they thought that something was not working. They were not sure, maybe it was wrong with Yeltsin's democracy. Though under Yeltsin, Russia built feeble foundation, but it was a foundation for future improvement. It was a market economy, not well functioning, but it was there. That's why Russia could easily survive in 1998 during this financial crash, and immediately the recovery has immediately started. And in 2000, the year Putin took over, was the year of the highest growth of GDP in Russia, more than 10%, with oil being just $20 a barrel. But the economy was functioning. But then oil, that's a curse for democracy. Oil price went up. Just, it was skyrocketing from $20 in 2000 to $147 in 2007. And Putin could use this money to improve the lives of millions of our compatriots. And they thought, wow, maybe this is democracy. Because we still vote, we keep voting. Putin was smart enough not to close this window. Of course, elections were rigged, controlled, but it didn't look like, the sort of the charade for millions of people, because they could see the results. Their living standards have dramatically improved. And what helped Putin to convince Russian public that he was a truly democratic leader was his rise as the leader, as a host of, they called it G8, before it was G7, 7 great industrial democracies. I always stumbled because I didn't believe it was G8. I always called it G7+1, because G7 stood for 7 great industrial democracies. And I didn't believe Russia was a democracy, and I doubted even great industrial power. But in 2006 in St. Petersburg, Vladimir Putin was a host of this event, and he managed to turn it into a big coup for his propaganda machine. I could shout, Garry Kasparov, my friends like Boris Nemtsov or others, we could shout that Putin regime was not a democracy. We could try to explain the sort of the true nature of the KGB rule. But On one side, you had few dissenting voices in the desert. On the other side, you had Putin surrounded by Bush, Blair, Berlusconi, Chirac, all the leaders of the free world. Who you believe to? It worked out. And by the time when Putin ended his second term, he was already all-powerful. There was still a moment to walk away. I believe by that time he was already the richest man on the planet, and he could have many options. For instance, to buy International Olympic Committee and to become the president for life there. And when he decided to stay in Russia as the technical prime minister, by the puppet master, I knew he was there for life. Unfortunately, it worked out, this cover-up operation worked out perfectly with Washington and with other European capitals. Despite the fact that in 2008, Putin's Russia had the first aggression against the former Soviet state. Russia invaded a tiny Republic of Georgia. That was the end of the Bush presidency, and I guess he already realized that he made a mistake. And actually, his memoirs, he's the only probably politician among others, because I read memoirs of almost all politicians who were involved in US foreign policy the last 25 years. He actually confessed that he was wrong and he was betrayed. But it was too late. And the newly sworn president, Barack Obama, with his Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, they rewarded Putin for this aggression by offering the reset button. Reset button. Sunshine policy. So, message to Putin, no matter what you did, no matter what you would do in the former Soviet Union, you are exonerated, indulged. He remembered that. For 4 years, Putin, sitting technically, on the sideline, he has been grabbing more and more power, while the Western capitals, led by Washington, tried to put their weight behind Medvedev. Do you remember the name? Again, we should give Putin a credit. I mean, he found somebody who could stay 4 years in the presidential chair, having enormous power. Medvedev could fire Putin with a stroke of his pen. He did nothing against his master. He just added 2 more years for next presidential term, and he walked away. To my horror, the 4 years were wasted, and we knew that Putin's return to power would be a disaster, since from every history book we know that from the first phase, when dictator needs friends, he moves into the second phase, when he needs enemies, to justify his stay in power. Economy was already in a pretty lousy shape. Even before the sanctions and even a dramatic drop on the oil prices, because it was not a real economy. It was more like a pipeline economy. Russia has been losing steadily, its economic power, because Putin didn't care about any development. People criticize Yeltsin years for being tumultuous and corrupt, and I agree. Corruption under Yeltsin was a problem. Corruption under Putin has become a system. And in this situation, Putin had no chance but to build a new image. And what could be this image for a Russian president, already dictator at that time, who made it very clear that he would stay in Kremlin for the rest of his life? To become aggressive, to start attacking neighboring countries, and of course, challenging big powers. And America was naturally #1 target. Obama administration was unprepared for the challenge. But unfortunately, the whole idea about fighting with Russia, recognizing that the fight is inevitable for influence, that has not yet won the minds of US politicians. I'm sure you remember when Mitt Romney correctly named Russia as the #1 geopolitical foe of the United States in the debates. Obama trashed him. And Romney backed off because for him it was more like a sound bite. He didn't understand how vital was it. And Obama administration continued this, this tradition that started in the 90s with Clinton, is treating Russia like, the crazy uncle at the Thanksgiving dinner. Yes, don't mention democracy, don't talk about human rights. And Putin, again, he knew, how to benefit, from these short-sighted policies. And that's how we are moving now to this current crisis. Because the enemies of the free world that we are facing today in different form and shape, from Vladimir Putin's Russia to North Korean family dictators, to Iranian mullahs, to Chavistas in Venezuela, to stateless terrorists, I would call them time travelers. Because we know that in previous decades and centuries, the world was full of bad guys, but we could actually separate from them because they were far away, and we didn't have to bother about them. But in today's world, with all this communication, with the speed that everything could be moved around, we have to recognize that no one is safe, even protected by two giant oceans. Even in 2001, when Al-Qaeda training camps in Afghanistan were far away, the 19 terrorists crossing the Atlantic, or I don't know, Pacific, how they got in this country, in commercial airlines, killed more Americans than the entire Japanese fleet after many months of preparation in Pearl Harbor. Today, I'm afraid they don't even have to cross the ocean. They could do a lot of damage sitting somewhere in the cellar, attacking electric grid. The world, as I said, is getting smaller. And an idea that, what the events in somewhere in Syria or elsewhere, they will not affect our lives here, it's foolish. Because if you think you're done with the war, you should remember that war is not done with you. You cannot declare peace unilaterally, because they will go after you, they will go after all of us, because for Putin, for ISIS, for Iranian mullahs, attacking the free world, attacking us, is the only justification of their powers. They cannot compete with us in ideas, in innovations, in productivity. They have only one competitive advantage, if you may call it so, the value of human life. For us, each life is unique. For them, million dead is statistics. Moreover, they will feel more powerful by killing people. That's why they do it in public. That's why they demonstrate that they don't care, because that helps them to establish their image with those that they are subdued, those that they govern. Expecting them to change this attitude is just simply ignoring the fact that this is the very nature of their power. And shifting back for a moment to Vladimir Putin, he is a dictator who knows the rule of the game. He has to worry not about elections, not about debates. He never participated in a single debate in his life. The only debates in Russia were always between protesters and riot police. And of course, guess who won? He should worry about his inner circle, about generals, about oligarchs, because the moment dictator looks weak, he's dead. And he knows how to present his strengths. It's not accidental, and I'm always surprised to see, people here in America or in Europe being puzzled why Putin is making these pictures, bare chest picture. Why he does this, why he does that? Because that's the game, that's how he survives, that's his campaign. He should demonstrate every day, every hour, every minute that he is the only one. He is Putin the indispensable, the only defender of Mother Russia against enemies who are surrounding our country. He is invincible. He is the great who can defy anybody, starting, of course, with Washington. That's a number one target because it's the biggest enemy, and you should not be surprised. America, for quite a while already, is an enemy for Putin's propaganda machine on a daily basis. Of course, there are Jews, but they are on the dessert menu. America is still number one. And I think that his greatest propaganda trick was the trip to the United Nations General Assembly a few weeks ago, the end of September, if you remember. Putin showed up in New York City. The Wall Street Journal asked me to write an article about Putin's speech in the United Nations. I suggested politely that I could do it in advance. Because I said it would be irrelevant what he is going to say, since we all knew he would act anyway. Unfortunately, I added, it would be irrelevant to wait for what Obama would be saying, because we knew Obama would not act anyway. So now they still said, please wait right afterwards. I wrote it beforehand, but submitted it later. It was not about the speech. It was not about, presenting, his view of the world. It's all he needed is a meeting with Obama. Not to negotiate. He didn't care to negotiate. It was about handshake. You remember this reluctant handshake? I bet you he spent hours in front of the mirror practicing that. It's very important because Russian television demonstrated this picture. What they could see, Putin had no choice, because it's United Nations General Assembly, to go to New York, to the belly of the beast, to meet American president. He had to shake his hand. And the next day, Russian planes bombed in Syria American-backed opposition. Now tell me, what kind of image, it projected to the Russian public? All people could see, and it's not only Russia. It goes beyond Russia. It goes to Middle East. It goes to Europe. It goes to not only to American foes, but to American friends. They could see Putin has been sending military jets and advisors to Syria. They could see Iran has been sending troops and ammunition. And they could see Obama keep sending John Kerry. I'm getting scared when I see John Kerry negotiating. No, actually, negotiating is the wrong word, because negotiation it's a give and take. Kerry negotiating it's one way. So and it's when I see Kerry, sitting with his Russian counterpart Sergei Lavrov, the Minister of Foreign Affairs. So I'm afraid that if they stay for too long, Kerry probably would give Russia Alaska back. I even thought at one point that America had two big problems. Domestically, it's Obamacare, and internationally, it's Obama-Kerry. And now it's going to this current crisis and all these tragic events, recent events. I'm sure there will be questions asked. I hear often, Putin plays chess while Obama is playing checkers. Now, not that I'm going to defend, the game President Obama is playing, but I have to defend the integrity of my game. And I have to tell you that it's absolutely wrong to think that Putin has been playing chess. The game of chess is a transparent game. It's 100% information available for you and me. We're at the same board. We don't know what the opponent is thinking, but we know exactly what he or what are resources of our opponents are available now. Putin is playing a different game. I would rather call it geopolitical poker. That's a game for a KGB agent. It's a game of a bluff. You can win with a weak hand. You don't have to have a very strong hand if you know how to bluff. And especially if you know how to read your opponent's mind. And if you know that if you raise the stakes, your opponent will fold the cards. The best demonstration of Putin's dramatic victory in this geopolitical poker was 2 years ago. Obama's infamous red line in Syria. I'm not here to discuss whether it was a good or bad idea to draw a red line. But when the red line is drawn by the US president and somebody crosses it, you shoot. You don't negotiate. It's called red line. And Putin knew how to use this weakness. And I predicted that it would lead to dramatic consequences. It would lead to a disaster in the Middle East and elsewhere, because everybody could see that military option was off the table. I mean, not that, you have to throw this option at the table all the time. The strengths of the leader, of a statesman, is not to send troops all over the place, but to make a credible threat. The choice is not between war and appeasement, because between war and appeasement there is a big territory called leadership. And I said at that time that I could see a game where Putin had the weak hand, say, pair of 5. But he acted as if he had royal flush. And Obama had full house. But he flashed it in the toilet. And what is important now is just to understand that the strength of democracy is in lasting institutions, in transparency. And that's why we have to go back to force them to play chess. That's a game I do understand. And again, just to wrap up this presentation, I could, first I was looking for a quote from Richard Nixon, just to give a tribute, that could be relevant, and I think it was more than relevant to remind us today what he said, that United States cannot be a pitiful, helpless giant, or totalitarianism and anarchy will spread. That's a strong message. And to end up on a slightly more positive note, I could just say a few words about my personal experience, because my mother and my son, they still live in Moscow. I had to leave Moscow in 2013. People ask me if I can go back. I say, yes, I can go back, but it's a one-way ticket. And I used to buy a round trip. My mother, by the way, just tells me that she's 78. She was born and raised under Stalin. So she saw every phase of Soviet propaganda. And she tells me now that Putin's propaganda machine is much worse, because under Soviet rule, we still could feel, she said, some elements of positive future. There were some ideas that we all, become brothers. It's a bright future where communism will prevail. So there was kind of, positive agenda. I'm not going to excuse, this propaganda machine, but there were some elements that could make people feel good. Putin's propaganda machine, it's a cult of death. It's all about conflict, confrontation, war, enemies. There's not a single, beam of sunlight. And that's the difference. But as I promised, the positive side is about my son. He's 19. He lives with my mother in Moscow, and he recently visited me. He joined me for a Midwest leg of my book tour. We spent a couple of days in New York, and then we went to St. Louis, Kansas City, and Chicago. And when we landed in Kansas City and we were driven, into the hotel, so we saw some pictures, and one of them was an amazing picture of locals celebrating the triumph of the Royals in the World Series. And I don't know, 800,000, 1 million people, a huge crowd there. So it is, well, I looked at it, with some curiosity, but my son was watching it, just with such an intensity and passion. And I said, Vadim, what for? I mean, what's so special about this picture? And he said, Dad, I had dreams that one day the same spontaneous demonstration would gather in the Red Square, and that will be the end of Putin's regime. Thank you.
Thank you, Garry. Garry has agreed to answer your questions. I first want to announce that Garry will be in the lobby to sign your book and meet every one of you. But first, before we go to questions, I'd like to show a video that confirms much of what Garry said.
In your memoirs, you wrote, you quoted Gladstone, I think, saying that a great prime minister must be a great butcher. Do you subscribe to the theory that a great president must be a great poker player?
It helps. The Russians, of course, are chess players. I never understood chess. It's much more complicated, much more complex. But many of the things you do in poker are very useful in politics and very useful in foreign affairs. One of the problems you see in foreign affairs, particularly in dealing with great leaders abroad, particularly those that are adversaries, is the almost insatiable tendency of American politicians to want to put everything out on the table. Their inability to know when to bluff, when to call, and above everything else, how to be unpredictable. Unpredictability is the greatest asset or weapon that a leader can have of a major country. And unless he is unpredictable, he's going to find that he loses a great deal of his power.
Now, believe it or not, I watched this video first time.
Well, I'd like to ask the first question, poker or chess? Which game should the next American president play?
It's before you play any game. I mean, you must have will to win. It's about, because every game is about winning or losing. If you don't have this attitude, you'd better not to play a game at all. So I hope that the next US president will realize that the reputation or the credibility of his office has been so badly damaged that he will have to demonstrate the resolve and skills to restore it as soon as he can. And again, I will return from poker to the game I know better, because today, it was not, by the way, the case in Richard Nixon's years, because Richard Nixon, as other contemporary presidents, they faced Soviet Union. And again, please don't, make me laugh saying that Putin is too dangerous compared to the Soviet leaders. Russia today, set aside nukes, but in every other aspect, is a pale shadow of the Soviet Union. I remember that a couple of weeks ago, I was interviewed by CNBC Closing Bell program that is filmed on the floor of New York Stock Exchange. And they asked me about, sanctions, U.S. sanctions, and the measures that the United States could take to prevent Putin's further aggressions. And I said that today, from this room, I meant the floor of the New York Stock Exchange, the United States could do more damage to Putin's Russia than all US presidents from Harry Truman to Ronald Reagan could do to the Soviet Union. So Putin's Russia is very vulnerable today, and that's why forcing them to play an open game, to call their bluff, to make sure that we'll play the transparent game, I think will lead to an eventual demise of the regime, because the moment Putin is defeated geopolitically, his days or hours in Russia will be numbered.
We have a question in the center row.
Thank you, Mr. Kasparov. And on behalf of Baltic Americans, we want to thank you for your support in the early 1990s for the restoration of independence for those countries. But right now, what is your prediction for the hundreds of thousands of these Middle Eastern refugees now invading Europe? What is your predictions with regards to NATO?
NATO? NATO, you said? NATO is an organization that cannot function without US leadership. So as long as US keeps leading from behind, NATO is headless. The solution of the crisis in the Middle East, it's not an easy one, but I would call it simple, because we do understand that the enemy must be defeated on its territory, and dropping bombs from 30,000 feet is not going to change it. I'm not an American citizen, so that's why I will not feel comfortable advocating for US soldiers returning to the region. But the problem is that you're facing enemy. We're all facing enemy, that is ruthless, cruel, and believes that killing citizens of the free world is justified in any form and shape. So the choice is either soldiers will meet them at the front line, or hundreds, thousands, if not more, civilian lives will be in danger. Yesterday I had an editorial in the Wall Street Journal, and there was, of course, not enough room in a newspaper just to present my views in full. But I think it's very important to remember that the story of Islamic State is not just 2 or 3 years old. Islamic State has been formed before. It has been defeated by Bush administration that many prefer to ignore. By 2008, Iraq was not probably a happy place, but it was stable. I didn't see millions of refugees. I didn't see tens of thousands of armed terrorists. According to a recent report confirmed by New York Times, the number of ISIS fighters at a time when Obama took over was between 500 and 700. Today it's from 50 to 80,000. There's a difference. So that's why to blame the invasion of Iraq in 2003 as the sort of cause of our problems today is simply to distort historical facts. And I meet different people in different audiences, and I know that at least half of this country, probably more now, is highly critical about invasion of Iraq, and I'm not going to defend this decision, but I always refuse to criticize that because I was born and raised in a communist country. I cannot criticize a decision that led to a demise of a dictator. And destruction of dictatorship doesn't guarantee freedom next day. I always say that dictator who stays in power for many years, for decades, always succeeds in eliminating the opposition and creating some kind of political desert. And the longer he stays in power, the drier desert is. And what kind of creatures can survive in the desert, in the dry desert? Snakes, scorpions, rats. So expecting that after 42 years of Gaddafi or 30-something years of Saddam, you could see immediate splash of democracy was naive. But invasion of Iraq offered a chance. This chance was not taken, was not used, but there was a chance. So that's why we should look not at 2003, but more at the decision to remove troops from this region in 2009, 2010. I could use another chess parallel, saying that if you made a bad move, you made a mistake, you had the wrong plan, and you reach a certain position that you don't like, the worst mistake is trying to go back and desperately trying to restore the status quo, which is already dead. You have to look forward and to play with the material you have in front of you, and the decision to remove troops, which was purely ideological decision, but I have to say that supported by 70 million Americans who voted for Obama, who was not hiding his intentions. It was a horrible mistake because it created vacuum. And power abhors vacuum. That's we know from the laws of physics. In geopolitics, there's no vacuum. The moment America retreats, somebody else comes in. Who came in this region? Iran first, Russia second. And they're not going anywhere because they could see weakness. And the weakness will embolden them for further attacks. And we know that the problem of the region based very much on the murderous rule of Bashar al-Assad. As long as he stays there, nothing will change. And for those who are advocating an alliance with, unholy alliance with Vladimir Putin, I could tell them that it will lead to a total disaster because Putin's agenda is exactly opposite to the United States and the free world. Putin wants crisis. Putin needs wars. Putin wants conflict in the Middle East to push oil prices back. He will get bankrupt soon. He can't afford even oil at 40 or 50. He needs more. And to get it, he should bring even Saudi Arabia in the conflict. And he knows how to play these cards. KGB had plenty of experience of fighting between Sunnis and Shia. They are far more experienced in this game. And let's not forget that, for those who are advocating Americans retreat from the region, very close by, there's a small state called the State of Israel. Do you think that Israel will be able to stay away from all these conflicts? Because they can keep killing each other, but they always get united when they have to kill Jews. And I could also point out that one of the demands of Russian delegation at the negotiations in Vienna, was to remove Hamas and Hezbollah from the terrorist list. So that's why expecting NATO to operate on its own without the United States, wishful thinking. Though I understand that Eastern Europeans, could try to defend themselves, but again, without America, it will be very difficult for them to stand against Russians. Though if you ask them, Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians, Poles, they know the threat is real. They know that, they're facing a desperate dictator who at any point could change, the direction of his aggression and move against former Soviet republics or other bordering states. Just to give you one idea about the mood in the region is, about 7 weeks ago, I spoke at a big business forum in Helsinki, Nordic Business Forum. And it was impolite or just, not fair from me to open my keynote speech with a joke. I said, happy to be here, Helsinki, Finland, nice. Huh? By the way, yesterday Russian television called Finland a northwestern part of the Greater Russia. 5,000 people, not a single laughter. I waited for about 5 seconds and I said it was a joke. But I had to apologize because looking at the faces of people, I probably caused a few heart attacks.
We have time for one more question.
Mr. Kasparov, I am not a very good chess player, but I have a lot of respect for someone that could think the way you think. One of the things I read in your book was that surprised me was the inability of the Russian people to understand what it was to live in a free society. You talked about it here, where you compared the election box for the ATM teller. And me being an American, I have no idea what it's like to live in a communist society under true oppression.
You're lucky.
I'm blessed, sir. I'm
blessed.
blessed. And so when I see people in America today and all this stuff that's going on the university campuses and all these people crying oppression, How do you respond to that, and how can we possibly communicate to them what real oppression looks like?
I have a lot to say about it. And, I understand we're running out of time. I can just tell you that when Hillary Clinton, at one of the debates, spoke passionately about the excesses of capitalism, I responded in my Twitter saying that excesses of capitalism are much better than success of socialism. That's...
Thank you very much, Garry. Please give Garry another round of applause. Garry will be available in the lobby to sign your books, but first, we'd like to present him with a copy of President Nixon's first book, which he wrote after he was vice president, Six Crises.
Thank you.
It's also available in our museum store for purchase, but thank you again, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you. This one?